Well, greetings, everyone. This is Joyce Davis. I am the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And we are here to have another, I think, very, very important discussion about a topic that I think is not only of national security, but of global security and of global interest. We are going to talk about U.S. China relations in the midst of these very tense times. I think we all have to agree. And to join me for that discussion will be an expert with the United States Institute of Peace, Andrew Scobell. And he has alerted me that he has ties to our region. It was at Carlisle, the U.S. Army War College at Carlisle for a while, so he knows our region very, very well. But before I give him a formal introduction and tell you about his most distinguished bio, we were simply going to share our screen, let us watch the video that's been produced by the Foreign Policy Association. Now, again, just a warning, this video was produced a while back, so it probably was clearly not going to take into account most recent developments, but it will provide us, I think, a foundation for our conversation. So, with that, stay tuned. I'm going to share my screen and we will begin watching this Foreign Policy Association video.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. Today's assignment is the most important relationship of the 21st century. These two very large, capable countries squaring off one against the other, or perhaps working with each other to jointly manage the international system. One of the questions that we raise is whether or not the Chinese had a preference in the 2024 national election here in the United States. Conventional wisdom is that Xi and the Chinese would be concerned more about Trump and his proposed trade war, high tariffs, than the Democrats. But in reality, Mr. Biden really continued the tariff policy of Mr. Trump against Chinese imports. Additionally, there seems to be a much deeper concern in Beijing about the United States, and that is our growing consensus, even fixation, on the idea that China is, without question, an adversary, one that threatens the American position at the top of the international system, and that a confrontation in the form of a Cold War or possibly even a hot war lies on the horizon.
All of us who have dealt with the Chinese government over the years have bumped up against a deeply held suspicion that the West, led by the United States, seeks to contain China, to isolate China.
Graham Allison just wrote a book about this. Graham says in the last 500 years, we've seen this emerging status quo thing about 20 times. He says, we always manage to get from the old equilibrium, pre-emergence, to the new equilibrium, post-emergence. That's good. The dark plot is that in about 3 out of 4 cases, the way we get from the old to the new equilibrium is through a process that goes by the popular name global war.
We begin by looking at China's evolution over the course of modern world history. If we go back to 1500, we'll see that China, along with several other areas of the world, were considered power centers. They were very large geographically. They were gunpowder empires, and the fact that they used crude military force like gunpowder to expand their empires and maintain control over their populations. By the middle of the 19th century, imperialism had arrived in China. The Europeans went in, they broke down the doors, and they dictated terms to a very proud ancient civilization. To this day, Chinese school children learn about this century of humiliation at the hands of the Westerners. By the start of the 21st century, China had reemerged as a major force in world politics, designated as a great power. The 3 major powers since World War II have been the Soviet Union, the United States, and the People's Republic of China, although their trend lines are somewhat different. For the United States, we grew in global power and influence, peaking sometime in the 1990s. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disintegrated, we were the sole remaining great power. We were the dominant force in international affairs, a uniquely American moment. Over the course of these last couple of decades, however, America's influence in the world, our status has been in decline. A good bit of that is self-inflicted wounds, waging wars abroad that were incredibly long, painful, and costly, places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and shying away from the leading role that we have played for previous generations. For the Soviet Union, now Russia, well, it made it through the Cold War era, but the decline was pretty clear by the 1980s. Gorbachev recognized that. He negotiated with the Western world to normalize relations, and things have not gotten better for the Russian Federation. Demographically, it's in steep decline. Geostrategically, it's overextended, and the economy of Russia impresses no one. It's hard to be bullish on Moscow moving forward. And then we have China, today's topic, which made its way through the Cold War largely unscathed, but not growing much in power at all until the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, and then we saw the rise of China to great power status. So yes, trajectory-wise, China is closing in on the United States in a number of basic measures and indicators of power and influence. In fact, some have argued that China is already surpassing us as the largest economy in the world. Here you can see the 2, China in red, as a share of global GDP. But for people who have followed my lecture series for the past several decades will know, GDP is not my go-to number. I look at GDP a lot like I view cholesterol. It's just a number. There's good GDP and bad GDP, just like with cholesterol. And so building an airplane and selling it on the global market, that's good GDP. That's good economic activity. But when that plane crashes, that's also GDP. Any economic activity goes into the calculation. So it's not just about how large is your GDP, what is the balance between positive GDP, positive economic development and activity, and negative? Building up for a war, contributes to the GDP just as waging a war does. We see that reflected in Russia's economic trendline. You'll notice that the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 resulted in massive economic sanctions that undermined the ability of Russia to be competitive. And during those first few years of sanctions, Russia's economy was negative. It was shrinking. And then all of a sudden, we see Russia doing much better. The GDP is up. But is that a good thing? Because that is a war economy. And war economies cannot last forever. It's no different in many ways with China. All of these housing units, for as far as the eye can see, they're new. That's great economic development if someone buys them, lives in them, pays off the mortgage, gets a job, and contributes to the larger economy. But these are called ghost cities for a reason. They're all over China, especially on the seaboard, where the government is simply overdeveloped for the sake of developing. This graph shows you areas where demolition is likely to happen on housing units. There are just far too many of them have been built for far too little demand in the market. Today, some 65 million vacant housing units exist in China. That is not good GDP. So yes, Russia's economy is growing, as is China's. But Russia's is underwritten by the diversion of all economic activity to a war footing. And China's is driven, at least in part, by the billions of dollars the government has poured into the economy, not as a result of market demand, competition, or innovation, but merely as a means of the government juicing the economy. What happens to those two countries when the war ends in Russia and the funds run out? They simply can't pour any more in. You're likely to see rather significant economic declines. Thinking of the United States and the flawed nature of GDP measurements, if we could wave a magic wand and solve any societal problems, we might start with crime, eliminating it, drug abuse, gone, and maybe even the moonshot that Mr. Biden talked about, solving the puzzle of cancer. If we got rid of these three things in our economy, our society, our economy would decline by 7%. And classic economists would be sounding the alarm bell that the American economy is going downward. But these would be incredibly positive developments. We're just taking away really bad economic activity. So comparing China and the United States by GDP, by pure economic activity, I think is a very poor way to gauge the health and well-being of each of these two economies. Let's take a step back and talk a little bit about how great powers compete. After World War II, there were two massively impressive countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were on a collision course. Ideologically, philosophically, societally, and geostrategically, these two were competitors. And in this struggle, it's not surprising that the United States came out on top. China, for much of the Cold War era, from the founding of the Communist Party in 1949, for about 4 decades moving forward, it adhered to that Marxist ideology and the argument that there's an inevitable clash between capitalist and socialist societies. Deng Xiaoping redirected China. They began to work in the same direction as the United States, not ahead of it, as you see here, but in America's wake. And it was tremendously beneficial for China to do so. Riding in our economic wake allowed it to increase the amount of exports to Western markets, filling its coffers due to the trade imbalances. It created a massive sovereign wealth fund, which is like a national savings account. It can invest in stocks and bonds, gold and resources, real estate abroad, and continue to grow that fund. China, Saudi Arabia, and Norway have the largest of the sovereign wealth funds. Military modernization was undertaken in the 1980s and to this day, giving China a global footprint and also the confidence to renew its age-old claim over the South China Sea, the islands, reefs, and other areas such as oil deposits found therein. And finally, it's reflective in the Chinese ability to initiate the Belt and Road Initiative. More than $1 trillion offered to foreign countries to build ports, infrastructure, highways, and byways to allow China greater economic access and greater trading potential. All of this because China accepted our leadership and largely adopted our trading mindset. Today, I would say under Xi that China has altered course. It's no longer comfortable swimming in our wake. It feels like it is surpassing us in global influence and importance. It seeks to move away from the dollar-based global economic system. And that leads to the question of whether or not, at some point, these two massive countries will collide, economically or militarily. Maybe a standoff, a new Cold War, as we saw with the Soviets after World War II, or maybe they'll learn to work together and co-manage the international system based on common interests. What is very clear is that these two powers are the most important, and their relationship will define the 21st century. Four very different perspectives on what China is and how the U.S. should handle it in terms of our foreign policy. There are the political realists who argue China has already entered the great power club. It's influential. It defines its interests globally. It has a significant military capability. Demographically, geographically, it's impressive. Treat it with respect as a great power. A policy of containment, similar to that used after World War II with the Soviets, would be needed, finding peace through strength, and jointly managing those areas where there's common agreement. Classic Henry Kissinger. The neocons, very different perspective. They recognize, as we all do, that China is on the rise, a great power indeed. But for them, the alarm bells go off because the neocons' primary interest is in keeping the United States at the top of the international food chain. So we should adopt instead a policy of degrading China, weakening China, minimizing its impact in the world so that it remains at least a full tier below the US in global stature. Now it is peace through dominance, and war, if necessary, should be waged to prevent China from surpassing the US and taking over the mantle of global leader. Liberal internationalists, they look at things economically, and they recognize China is a pretty significant economy. There's a lot there of interest to us. Our industries relocate to China to take advantage of their labor rates, their lax regulations, export to Asia and beyond. So for them, it's all about trade, opportunities to make a profit in a mutually beneficial relationship. Their idea is peace through interdependence. If the US and China are trading at a very high clip, the cost of war between them goes up exponentially. We rarely go to war with countries where we have a high level of trade. But that trade, according to the liberals, has to be fair. The Chinese cannot keep underwriting their domestic industries and blocking the arrival of American goods. And then we have the America Firsters. They argue that China is undermining the United States, that the hollowing out of America's industrial heartland is a result of international trade and unfair trading policies.
For many years, the United States systematically opened our economy with few conditions. But while we lowered market barriers, other countries didn't open their markets to us.
China has virtually unfettered access to the United States market. They can sell almost anything they want in the United States. It's probably charitable to call the playing field with China uneven. We literally aren't even on the same planet, given how much access they have to our market, how little access we have to their market. And you've got to use some tough love. You've got to use tools like tariffs to change that.
They view economics as a zero-sum game, classic mercantilism. If China wins, by definition, we lose. Therefore, we need to win in the economic battle. And to win, we're going to sanction China. We're going to place taxes or tariffs on their imports. And if necessary, we're willing to wage a trade war against them because the America First crowd believes we can beat China in a trade war. Peace is now through separation, getting away from China, trading less with it, finding our own supply lines that avoid China, and therefore not being in a position where China has leverage over us. And you find that position through self-sufficiency, by creating most everything your society needs here at home, or at a minimum, importing it from allied countries. So these four perspectives on China each takes us in a different direction. What we have in the United States is a bipartisan consensus, which is very rare to talk about. We seem to agree on very little, Republicans and Democrats, but on China, there is an agreement in the foreign policy establishment and among the American public that China is acting aggressively. And as such, it is a growing threat to America's strategic interests. So let's take a look at this aggressive behavior by China. The military is growing, a pretty remarkable uptick in the quantity and the quality of China's military. It has a very large navy, the Air Force is growing quickly, and an extraordinarily large grounded army. It may not have the best quality because it's not a battle-tested military, but the numbers are undeniable. Pressure that Beijing puts on Taipei. Taiwan, of course, is across the Formosa Strait. It's where the Republic of China resides, and it is claimed by mainland China. Thirdly, claims to the South China Sea over all of those islands and oil deposits. And finally, China is competing for allies. There are bidding wars happening from the Pacific to the Caribbean and well beyond between China and the United States. We win some, we lose some, but it concerns observers that China is competing with the United States in global popularity. The question is this really aggressive behavior? I mean, you could certainly reach that conclusion. When I view these activities, I say that's really quite normal. It's expected of a great power. I mean, how else does a great power behave? And I'm most concerned of these four of China's claims over the South China Sea. And it's not because, life ends if China controls that area, but rather this strikes at a core American global rule that we developed in 1945, the Pax Americana Order. We talked in a recent lecture about Bretton Woods in 1944 and the free trade regime. Well, that was one of three cornerstone rules that essentially have clarified, simplified, and stabilized the global system since the Second World War. One principle is sovereign integrity. Nation states enjoy control over their territory, and no nation has the right to take it away. Free trade, and finally, open sea lanes for international travel and commerce. These are the three anchors. The United States is beginning to attack the free trade regime. As we saw in the previous lecture, we've lost confidence that trade can be truly fair, so we're taking steps away from it. Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, and of course its annexation of Crimea before that, direct assaults on the sovereign integrity principle. And China is in the sea lanes because it's claiming sovereignty over a vast amount of sea where a great deal of the international trade and traffic flows through. Here you can see China's South China Sea claims, extensive, all of that area shaded in red. Generally speaking, the American rule is that each country has a 12-mile maritime boundary that is its sovereign domain. Beyond that, each country enjoys 200 miles of exclusive economic zone. Unless, of course, these zones run into the zone of another country, then they have to split them in half. But as you'll note from this graph, China's claims extend far beyond 12 or 200 miles, and they're actually claiming these areas as sovereign domain, meaning no one can enter them without the permission of China. We should note, this is not necessarily a communist policy. This dates back more than a century. From the founding of the Republic of China on the mainland, there's been this extensive claim to the seas around it. but it does threaten the American global rules-based order system. It is a direct threat to Pax Americana, and for that reason, we must resist the Chinese, undermine their argument that they have a legitimate claim to vast amounts of the China Sea.
The Chinese see it as, well, you Americans, after consolidating your continental landmass at the end of the 19th century, went on to strategically dominate the Caribbean, the greater Caribbean. So these seas are our Caribbean. Why should we be any different than you?
When China is told that it has been aggressive, its answer is that no, China has showed extraordinary restraint.
How about the Taiwan question? It's where everyone goes in almost any discussion of China. If there is ever to be a war between the United States and China, and of course we've been there before, 1950 to 1953 on the Korean Peninsula, it is likely preceded by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So the question becomes, what would cause the Chinese to invade Taiwan? I think it's a pretty obvious answer: a Taiwanese declaration of independence. If Taiwan declares independence, not as the ROC, Republic of China, but the ROT, Republic of Taiwan, Beijing has little choice but to go in and go in hard. They cannot let the Taiwanese proclaim independence. And so American foreign policy should probably be based, at least in part, on preventing that from happening, making it very clear that this would be unacceptable because it would likely be a prelude to a Chinese invasion of the island and possibly a link and a cause of a U.S.-Chinese war.
China has actually shown a great deal of nuance, strategic patience, wisdom here. I would be surprised and very disappointed in Chinese statecraft, which has generally been careful, if Chinese statecraft decided they had to go overly dramatic with regard to Taiwan's status right now.
So the policy moving forward, what are we to do on strategic issues? Well, we can recognize on the spectrum that on one end is a deterred China that does not invade Taiwan for fear of an American response. And on the other end of the spectrum is an invasion of Taiwan by China. In all likelihood, how things unfold is somewhere in between, what we call gray zone attacks, where Beijing takes actions somewhere between war and peace, and they're doing it for political objectives. For example, air and naval exercises all around the island of Taiwan, especially when national elections are underway, cyber attacks on the island, and direct or indirect election interference. These are all designed to intimidate Taiwan and to prevent it from declaring independence. Making public statements, talking about the plans to invade the island by a certain year, these all fall into that category of gray zone attacks and should be interpreted as such. So what do we do? How are we to neutralize the Taiwan issue? First step would be to recommit to the Shanghai Communique of 1972. This is the agreement between Mr. Nixon and the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong. To China, we say, unification, according to the communique, is by peaceful means. And to the Taiwanese, we say, don't even consider talking about independence, much less making a declaration. We should all remember that in 1972, the United States recognized there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of that China. And within a decade's time, we shifted recognition from the island of Taiwan to the mainland of China. So we have hinted in very strong terms to the Chinese that we acknowledge their sovereign rights over Taiwan. We simply remind them they're legally bound to unify by peaceful means. In other words, I'm calling for a change of the power politics game away from the draconian statements and measures that invariably increase the likelihood of war from a zero-sum calculation to a more mutually beneficial one. But of course, Taiwan's not the only issue on the agenda. And with the election of Mr. Trump, there's a lot of talk of increased tariffs punishments to China for untrade practices, and really a separation of these two economies. You'll see from this graph that Mr. Trump just got started in 2018 with $250 billion worth of sanctions applied to Chinese imports. Left off the table at the time, another nearly $1/3 trillion that could be applied as well. With his reelection, Mr. Trump may well begin to apply those tariffs also. He's even talked about the possibility of a 100% tariff added to all Chinese imports. In favor of such an argument, well, you take the price of any Chinese imported good, add a tariff of 5, 25, 50%, whatever number we decide. That's going to immediately lead to a higher market price for that Chinese good and a reduced interest in Americans in buying it. That signals to American producers they have an opportunity because now they can be competitive. China's been punished with tariffs, a tax has been added to their import. There's opening now to produce a product and show a profit in so doing. And overall, it might lead to more balanced trade between the United States and China. The warning, however, must be considered because China is not likely to just absorb the American tariff policy. It's very likely to retaliate with its own, which means American producers will struggle to export their goods into the Chinese market and may ultimately lead to a trade war between the two countries. I like to think in terms of trend lines and where they're heading. Economically, I see the US and China increasingly placing barriers between each other for cordial and productive economic relations, likely reducing the amount of trade. Having said that, we're not the only games in town. There are lots and lots of other countries out there. Their economies large and small. And so in many ways, the race is on for the US to cordon off its portion of the world, countries it's willing to trade freely with, and also gain access to their supply chains. And the Chinese are likely going to do the exact same thing. A few countries, as you can see, are caught between the two. They're going to do their best to play both sides of the line. I can imagine India, Brazil taking such a posture. But likely we're looking at separate supply lines and separate trading systems, perhaps even with separate rules between the US side and the Chinese-led side. Interesting times, no doubt, in the Sino-American relationship. The most important relationship of the century is certainly still unfolding before our eyes. It gives us ample opportunity to debate and discuss how best to handle China geostrategically, economically, and politically. Thank you as always. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Well, that was a most informative overview, although it is a little behind the times because we do have tariffs, it seems. But we have an expert who is going to help us walk through these issues. It's Andrew Scoville, and he is a distinguished fellow with the China program at the United States Institute of Peace. He focuses on U.S. China relations, China's armed forces and defense policy, and China's foreign relations with countries and regions around the world. And that's with a particular emphasis on the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And he has spent more than 10 years as a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. And well, let's just say he is definitely a very acclaimed expert on the topics that we're dealing with today. I warned him I can't go into his bio in full because it is extensive. So with that, I am going to first of all thank Andrew Scobell and welcome him now to offer his comments. Andrew.
Thank you, Joyce. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you just fine.
Okay. Well, I thought I'd make 4 points in reaction to the video we just watched, because I thought it was pretty good, but I think some of the in some aspects I think it was a bit might be a bit misleading. The first the first point I'd like to make is I don't think there's any almost zero chance that Taiwan is going to declare independence. I mean, it made it sound like they're far too smart. They recognize that's an invitation to attack from an attack from China. So that ain't going to happen. But the problem is that China, China's red lines where Taiwan are concerned are not so clear because, as I said, the Taiwanese are not going to declare independence, but they may do things that Beijing perceives as moving further towards de facto or de jure independence. And so that's where that line is, where those red lines are unclear. What I think it did a good job of highlighting was so-called gray zone activity, by which we tend to mean Beijing has increased its pressure and coercion against Taiwan, but below the threshold of war. And that's frankly the toughest, what I call the China challenge of now is how do you counter this? Is this tough for Taiwan? This is tough for the U.S. military, and frankly, it's tough for countries around the world because what China's doing against Taiwan is really what it's doing in many ways to almost every country around the world. But what it's doing towards Taiwan is on steroids. It's so that gray zone, whether it's influence operations, interfering in elections, economic coercion, that many countries around the world experience it, but Taiwan is experiencing it on steroids. Second point I'd like to make, the video talked about that China's competing for allies. It's a little bit, it's kind of true, but officially, China doesn't do alliances. In fact, they criticize the United States for having, alliances and like NATO and with Japan and hub and spoke alliances throughout the Indo-Pacific. And China asked the question, why do you need these alliances? Who's the enemy? And of course, they figured the enemy is us, China. So China doesn't officially do that. Even with the Russians, they have close military cooperation, but they call these relationships strategic partnerships. Yet, a good number of these strategic partnerships, including their relationship with Russia, have what I call alliance-like characteristics. But that's also, it talked about China being in a popularity competition contest around the world. That's true. That's really true. China is trying to compete with the United States for influence around the world. The third point I'd like to touch on is I think near the beginning of the video, I think there was the observation made that the U.S. is in decline. Technically, I think that's not accurate. We're not in absolute decline by any measure, but what the U.S. is in relative decline relative to other countries. So China's, as was depicted in the video, China's economic power, its military power, and it didn't talk about technological power, but that's also a dimension I would emphasize. China's growing. Some other countries are growing too, at the U.S. expense, and yet the United States is still the number one technological power. We still have the world's largest economy, but our share of the global economy, our influence around the world has been declined somewhat relative to other countries. So I think that's an important point to make. And the last point I'd make is that about how China is characterized in terms of its global thinking globally. I think I scribbled down a quote: China increasingly defines its interests globally. I think that's true. However, I think fundamentally, ruling Chinese Communist Party is really concerned about domestic problems, like the economy. There was a discussion of that in the video. They're also concerned about the potential for political, social unrest, and political subversion, and those. So its primary concerns, are what China calls its core interests. The Chinese Communist Party calls its core interests are domestic. So that's really, and they would include, we wouldn't, but they would include Taiwan in that dimension. But other issues like Tibet, Xinjiang, that's core interests. So you have this unusual situation, a strange situation where China's never been more engaged and more active around the world, and yet they've never been more secure. Their borders never been more secure. They've never been stronger, more prosperous in many centuries. And yet the ruling dynasty, if you will, the Chinese Communist Party, has never been more insecure. And so and that's a puzzle. That's a paradox in some ways, and it makes it hard for the U.S. To cooperate with China, to try and cooperate with China, because of that level of suspicion and insecurity. And then, as the video, I think, well pointed out, that's been matched by alarmism in the United States about the China threat. So anyway, those are just four points. Hopefully that's helpful and not further muddy the waters.
Well, clearly these are complex issues, but that was very,
Sure.
very helpful to at least lay out what you see as these top issues. But I will tell you, the one thing struck me when you mentioned that despite the things going in China's favor, it is so feeling so insecure.
Mhm.
Now, what that raises for me, as was raised in the video, does this increase the likelihood of a military confrontation? And so talk a little bit about that, because generally when people are insecure, they get offended really easily, right? And they
Yeah.
and right now, I mean, it's just not clear what the Trump administration's attitude is toward global aggression, really using military. And so talk about that. What, are we any closer to a confrontation?
Um, I'm a recovering political scientist. I have a PhD in political science. I kind of jokingly say that, but the academic in me says, well, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. But the good news, the good news is that I think neither country, neither major power wants a war, and we're looking for both in Beijing and Washington, looking for ways to avoid a conflict. Um, but I think there is the danger of slipping into an unwanted conflict, inadvertent escalation, and the most likely spot. I mean, there are a range of flashpoints, but the most likely one is not surprisingly is the Taiwan Strait. So let me just make one more point about on this. I think it towards the beginning of the video, it asked, who did Beijing have a favor, was Beijing backing, Trump or Harris in the 24 election? I think that's a really interesting question. And I don't claim to know the answer for sure, but I think one factor here is that I think Trump was seen as, on the one hand, someone that the Chinese figured they may be able to do business with, and yet at the same time, the biggest concern about um, a Trump presidency from the Chinese was he's unpredictable, and whether you're a U.S. ally or a U.S. adversary, what you look for in the United States is sort of predictability. and reliability. And so some would say that President Trump's greatest one of it is he keeps people guessing because he is unpredictable, and I think we've seen that over the past few weeks. But there is a downside to that, and it makes it. I think it elevates the potential for a conflict, even though, if you had to ask me for a percentage, I'd say the chances of a U.S.-China hot war would be, pretty low, but it's not zero.
It's not there. Well, let's delve into this a little bit more. On one hand, I want to ask you about, are we prepared for that militarily? But let's leave that aside for now. Where I really want to go is a little bit more positive, although not necessarily positive for Taiwan. And that is, I don't think, let me just I don't see from the Trump administration that it would risk anything to save Taiwan. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe I am wrong. It just doesn't seem to me that that's their thinking, that they would risk whatever what the U.S. would have to do to save Taiwan, that they would say, China, take Taiwan. Am I right or wrong about that?
Well, my honest answer is I don't know if you're right or wrong, but
Nor do I.
I don't think it's quite that simple because yes, um, yes, President Trump could. He's definitely unconventional. He's willing. He's willing to entertain things that another president. It's hard to imagine. Like, for example, in the first Trump administration, meeting with the leader of North Korea. That's pretty. So there's. He's definitely unconventional, and he's obviously the most powerful. The buck stops with him. The final decision is his. But I think he has key advisors who he listen. I think he listens to that would counsel otherwise. So his chief of staff, his national security advisor, he has some very strong China hawks. I would call them China hawks, who I think would tend to argue in support of uh, uh, favoring continuing to support Taiwan. So I
Right. And
don't think it's quite that. I think it's on the one hand, there are these tendencies that I think Trump might have, but I think his he is likely to listen to the advice of his senior advisors and staffers who will probably, I think, almost certainly give him different advice.
Okay. Well, let's now delve into just are we really prepared? My concern here is I'm hearing all of this from the video of just how much power militarily China, has.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I talk to military folks in the United States, and I get lots of op-eds from them because I'm Penn Live's editorial writer,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm hearing from them that there's great concern about U.S. military preparedness, whether we have enough tanks or whether we have enough airplanes or whether ships even, and how
Mm-hmm.
quickly we can gear up for a major conflict like something would involve with China. So talk to me about that. I mean, if we were to get into a scuffle with China, are we prepared?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't claim to definitively know their answer, but I have wrestled with these issues and talked to regularly engage with experts in Washington and people in the Pentagon, and I think there is precisely this concern: are we prepared? And part of it is it's the tyranny of distance. If there's a war with China, conflict with China, it's likely going to be on China's doorstep, on around China's periphery, maybe in the South China Sea, maybe in the Taiwan Strait. Those are the most plausible areas, and obviously that's much closer to China than it is to the United States, and so China can bring a lot more to bear very very quickly. what the video didn't talked about China's Navy, but China has the largest coast guard in the world, and it has a maritime militia, aka fishing boats. So it can bring, especially close to along China's seaboard in the within the so-called First Island chain, South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait. There's a lot that China can bring to bear, including cruise and ballistic missiles and so on. And the U.S. is we have bases in the region, but we just need to project power a lot further. Then there's the question of, we still, I think, have the best military in the world, but we're not replacing our platforms in the way that we should be, like our naval vessels, aircraft, Air Force. Our defense industrial base is not is really not in a very good way. So just to take the question of shipbuilding, we don't have a large shipbuilding, capability. China can churn out a lot more, and has churned out a lot more vessels than we have. The situation looks a little better if we include our partners and allies in this, but there are real concerns, whether it's the tyranny of distance, or our actual defense industrial base, and our aging aircraft and naval vessels.
Well, I have to tell you, I keep hearing if we turn to our allies, and also let's move to another angle here, and that is, we are now, many would say, in a trade war. We've just stepped into one, but it's not only just with China. It seems. I mean, we're our allies, people that love us, Canada, and where are our allies going to come from in this? I mean, does China have a stronger hand now because we have dissed so many of our friends? And even as we're looking at economics, the global economics, are we now at a disadvantage?
We could be. I think it's early days yet, and part of the tariff trade wars. It's kind of it's a tactic. It's a negotiating ploy in some ways. And so hopefully we will, or the Trump administration will reach, some kind of understanding with our partners and allies. But it certainly gives China an opening. And it's so if this continues, if these initiatives by the new administration continue across the board, then I think there is reason for concern. I tongue in cheek say America's best ally is actually China. And why do I say that? I say that because China has single-handedly turned so many countries around the world to look to the U.S. through its aggressive, coercive, and frankly arrogant behavior. And so even though just about every country in the world, its most important trading partners, China, they don't want to be under China's thumb or under China's boot. They really look. They've increasingly, because of that behavior I mentioned by China, they've increasingly looked to the United States for greater help, improved their relations, especially security relations, but also diplomatically. So, the question is, will we shoot ourselves in the foot? It's possible.
I mean, I'm hearing you're talking about, their aggressive behavior, but our behavior is no less aggressive right now. It's almost like if I'm a country here trying to figure out, do I want to go with the U.S. today, or do I want to go with China? I mean, I'd be hard pressed to figure out who's the gentler ally.
Yeah. Well, certainly the verbiage coming out of Washington these days puts that kind of gives that kind of impression, and it's a propaganda it's a propaganda coup for China. So hopefully, things will things will change. But it is worrisome because it does play into China's hands.
There's some other conversations we were having today with some other leaders of World Affairs Councils, and there's concern even about the cutoff with USAID
Mhm.
that's happening. And I mean, unfortunately, there are many people are saying it's gone now. I mean, there's even with stay on suspension of fundings, but the question there is people were asking, doesn't this play again into China's hands? China, by not having USAID and the US so engaged in um, these vital issues around the globe, China's not going to pull back, right?
Well, I mean, they have, as the piece video pointed out, China has its own economic problems domestically, and so they've had to pull back a little bit on their Belt and Road Initiative. They've gone they've focused more on smaller projects. But I think the messaging coming out of Beijing, and this was true, I think, has been true for a while now, is you can't really, the U.S. is untrustworthy and erratic. You can't count on them. Um, you can count on China. China's forever, and especially if in China's immediate neighborhood, that messaging can, along with, if U.S. actions and rhetoric seem consistent with that, it's pretty powerful. So, you figure, well, I can't if I can't count on the U.S., I kind of need to. I don't have much alternative but to be extra nice to China.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, it's a challenge.
It is a challenge, but let's move on to one other topic I think we have to discuss with you, with your expertise here, and that is deep seek and AI and all of that. I mean, we say that the US is still, the technologically superior, but is that really the case? Is China right on our heels, and might we be shocked again? Deep seek was a shock when they realized that they're really out there with their artificial intelligence and could threaten our dominance. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, even though I've done a lot of thinking and research on and tech issues and U.S.-China relations, I don't claim to be an expert on the subject, but I think, if we're, how do we understand what we're the China challenge and this global competition with China? Is it a new Cold War? You think about the old Cold War, and back in, I think it was 1957, the Sputnik moment when there was panic in the U.S. because the Soviets seemed to be technologically more ahead on space with the launch of the Sputnik satellite. I think with China, if we're in a new Cold War with China, then I think there have already been multiple Sputnik moments, and the AI challenge that you just mentioned is probably maybe the latest in that. So are they ahead? Are they overtaking us? There's certainly some evidence that to point to suggest that, but I think it's a little more complicated than that. In some areas, China has significant advantage. They have vast amounts of data that are pretty helpful in AI. Right? They collect data on just about everything, and they don't have privacy laws like we have in the U.S. About personal data. So that's an advantage. They have vast amounts of data that they can use, that AI can use, which is a plus. They have a central, even though that there is a market in China under Xi Jinping, what you've seen is sort of a re-centralization of authority and greater state control of the economy, including the technological sector. So on the one hand, that can be an advantage. They can make long-term plans, and they have and throw lots of resources at a problem. But in some ways, technological basic research and development and technology is more conducive to a more decentralized, market-driven approach, like we've had so far in the United States. So, just because Xi Jinping says we're going to do this, go forth and do this, and throws lots of money at it, and gets lots of people working on it and lots of scientists working on it, does that mean they're going to be able to innovate? Not necessarily. So I think rather than being petrified by what China's doing, we need to get our own act together, and continue to fund basic research, and encourage our best and brightest to go into the hard sciences, because I think American ingenuity, you can oversell it, but it's real, and our system is more conducive to leveraging and developing the technologies of today and tomorrow than the Chinese system.
I would tend to clearly agree with, as any American would, our ingenuity and our innovativeness and all that, except in the times we're living in, there seems to be so much disruption. We don't know where things are going. We don't know if money will continue to be flowing to universities we don't know if it's flowing to education. And so the final thing that I want to throw out there to you is also the issue of the U.S. pulling back from the WHO, from the World Health Organization. And that's another place that people have been concerned about China's influence, about whether it's out, it's working against us. And yet our pulling back and not having dialogue between our scientists and medical professionals and the world seems to me to again put us at a great disadvantage to China, which if it's aggressive, it's definitely aggressive in that realm as well. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
No, I share your concern. China's been aggressively putting their people in positions of authority in UN agencies, and supporting other candidates from other countries, sympathetic countries, in position of authority. So they've increased their influence in these international organizations, and we've kind of been asleep at the wheel and so even though we usually the U.S. tends to give much more funding to these organizations than China, than many other countries, including China. China's managed with a concerted effort to increase its power and influence in these bodies, including the WHO. And so, how has that happened? It's because we haven't paid enough attention and understood the value of the U.S. remaining engaged, remaining in a position of global leadership.
Right, right. Well, there's a lot that's going to be dissected in the coming weeks as we see more about what the new administration is going to do on the global economic market and elsewhere. But I guess to me, it's very, very clear from the video and from all that we know that this is probably the most important relationship right now, even perhaps over Russia, although there are many reasons to say that Russia, U.S. is important. But so I'm just wondering, as you look forward in your closing remarks, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? I mean, where do you stand on that, and what can anybody do about it?
Well, I think it really is about getting it right at home, and really putting America first, by investing in our people, ensuring that we educate, have people educate our young people, and really reinvigorate our economy, instead of pointing fingers at each other, and so that's really important in terms of you mentioned Russia. I love the quote that a U.S. official made about that. clarifying in his mind what the difference between Russia, the different challenge between Russia and China. He said that Russia is like a hurricane. It comes on, it comes on strong and looks terrifying, but we can, we kind of know how to prepare and know how to deal with that. But China is like climate change. It's slow, gradual, and long term. And I think that's a hurricane, clearly a problem. Whether it's against Ukraine, it kills people. It's nasty. But I think climate change is something that's much more challenging to deal with, and that may be a helpful way to, or a maddening way to look at to think about China. It really is challenging because unlike in the old Cold War, we kind of knew there were blocks of countries. We kind of it was there were communist party states. It was pretty clear that the world was kind of divided into two blocks. Today, it's much more ambiguous and confusing, and the U.S. and China are competing for friends and partners, many of the same friends and partners, and economically engaged with. So it's a lot more messy, a lot more complicated, and a lot more challenging. So all the more reason to have discussions like this to try and help people to understand the messy reality that we're dealing with globally.
You're absolutely well. Again, thank you for being willing to share your expertise on this to help our community better understand it. People will be tuning into this over the next few days, and we're also making it available to some of our schools. So your explanations will certainly not fall on deaf ears for this. But I guess it's the Chinese proverb that says, wishing you live in interesting times. That's a curse. So unfortunately, I think we are living in interesting times.
Definitely,
We
yeah.
really are. So, with that, I'm going to thank you again and wish you and your colleagues at the United States Institute of Peace all the best during these interesting times. So, with that,
Thank you, Joe.
goodbye, everyone. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye
Bye bye.
bye.